Have you ever been looking at a menu and just stopped and thought, wait a second, since when did that get so expensive? You're not imagining things. From chocolate to citrus, food prices are on an absolutely wild ride. So let's dive in and uncover the hidden stories behind the sticker shock on some of our favorite foods.
It all kind of starts with this one simple question. How does a food that, for the longest time, was considered an undesirable cut of meat, practically scraps,
Somehow end up as a $48 gourmet ravioli dish? And no, that's not a typo. $48. This isn't just about regular old inflation. This is a complete and total transformation. So let's start right there with a bony cut of beef that went from being totally overlooked to completely overbooked.
Okay, our first story is all about Oxtail. Its journey from scrap to status symbol is, honestly, the perfect example of how a sudden surge in popularity can completely flip the script on supply, demand, and, yeah, of course, the price. So, for generations, Oxtail was just an economy cut, right? It was a staple in communities that really knew how to slow cook it into something amazing. But now, it's this trendy, high-end ingredient you see on fancy menus. The secret got out, and suddenly, everybody wants a piece. And here's what happens when that demand goes through the roof. Just look at that climb. But here's the real kicker. Popularity can explode overnight, but the supply of oxtail, well, it can't. You only get about 4 to 6 pounds of oxtail from an entire cow. So when you have massive demand meeting a tiny fixed supply, prices really only have one direction to go, straight up.
Now, this crazy price hike has not gone unnoticed. Comedian Marlon Palmer totally captured the frustration of longtime oxtail lovers with his viral hashtag #MakeOxtailCheapAgain. It might have started as a joke, but it speaks to this real sense of cultural loss when a beloved, accessible food suddenly becomes a luxury item.
Okay, so that's what happens when demand explodes. But what about when it's not about surging popularity, but a collapsing supply chain that causes the crisis? For that story, we've got to turn to something the whole world loves: chocolate. The main villain in our chocolate story is this thing right here, the swollen shoot virus. It is an incurable disease, and it is absolutely wiping out cocoa trees at their source in West Africa, which, by the way, grows about 75% of the entire world's cocoa. The only way to deal with it is to cut down the infected trees, and those take years and years to replace. But it's not just the virus. Cocoa farmers are getting hit by a perfect storm. On top of the disease, you've got illegal gold mining operations, known locally as galamsey, that are just tearing up farmland. And then there's the extreme weather. Crazy droughts followed by floods that are ruining the harvests. It's a full-on crisis for the people growing the beans for our favorite treat. And here's the part that is just staggering. Even though they grow the vast majority of the world's cocoa, West African nations see only about 5% of the profits from the massive $200 billion chocolate industry. So when prices spike for us at the store, you have to understand that extra money is not trickling down to the farmers who are struggling the most. And this really shows you the two very different worlds of this crisis. You have the big corporations, and they adapt. They give us smaller bars. Hello, shrinkflation. They tweak their recipes to use less cocoa, and they just raise prices for us. But for the farmers, their reality is being forced to sell to a state board at a fixed price, so they can't even benefit from the global price surge that they are at the very center of.
All right, so we've seen cultural hype, and we've seen supply chain shocks. Our final story explores an even stranger reason for a high price tag, when government regulation and just the sheer difficulty of farming creates an intentionally scarce product. Let's talk about the very unique case of a citrus fruit called yuzu.
Okay, so get this. In Japan, fresh yuzu is everywhere. It's plentiful and cheap, but you cannot legally import the fresh fruit into the United States. Why? Well, it all comes down to the fear of agricultural pests hitching a ride and potentially devastating America's own citrus industry.
This ban creates such a wild contrast. Over in Japan, you've got this cheap fruit from these ancient outdoor trees. But in the US, you've got this tiny domestic industry growing yuzu in super expensive, controlled greenhouses and selling it for around $20 a pound. The regulation basically creates an artificial scarcity.
And to even make it work here, farmers have to use this incredibly skillful and labor-intensive process called grafting. It lets them produce fruit in just a couple of years, instead of the nearly 2 decades it would take to grow from a seed. It is some seriously cool agricultural science, but you better believe it adds to the final cost.
So, after digging into oxtail, cocoa, and yuzu, what is the real story behind the price on your plate? Well, the truth is, it's never just one thing.
The key takeaway here is that there are these different forces at play. Sometimes it's all about cultural hype, like we saw with oxtail. Other times, it's a complete supply chain collapse, which is the story of cocoa. And sometimes, it's a really complex web of regulations and just how hard it is to grow something, like with yuzu.
And all of that leaves us with one final, pretty fascinating question to think about. As our world keeps changing, our climate, our cultures, our supply chains, what food that we think of as totally ordinary today will be the oxtail or the chocolate of tomorrow? Definitely something to chew on.